Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking. We take your sources, stack the research, and distill the knowledge you need to grasp the most central ideas in Christian thought and history.
Today, we are opening up the book of Joshua. And for many, this book is, it's often read just as a military record, a quick conquest, then they divide up the land.
Right, a straightforward historical account.
But when you get past that surface reading and really look at the structure, the links back to Deuteronomy, and the theological language the narrator is using, you start to see something else. You're looking at one of the Bible's most tightly put together narratives about God's faithfulness and our conditional obedience.
That is absolutely what our source material is getting at today. We're doing a deep dive into sources that focus on Joshua as the successor to Moses, the incredible theological and even judicial meaning of the Jordan crossing, how God's law gets applied in these life and death moments, and the whole architecture of the narrative about the land itself.
And our mission today is really to get at the central paradox in Joshua. How can God's promises be declared fully kept? This already idea, when Israel's job to possess and hold on to the gift was, well, clearly not finished, but not yet.
We're going to be looking at how faith, obedience, and of course human disobedience shape success and failure in this covenant relationship that God sets up.
So let's start right where the book does.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this by starting with Joshua taking over from Moses. This isn't just a simple handoff, it's a theological changeover, showing the continuity of God's plan.
You've hit the main point there. The narrative creates this seamless bridge. We leave Moses talking to the nation in Deuteronomy, and the story just picks up right away after the death of Moses.
It's immediate.
It is. This straight-line history confirms the book of Joshua is just the next step, the carrying out of the commands God gave at Horeb and repeated on the plains of Moab. Israel has to go and take the land.
So it sets the timeline, but it also sets the theological scene. The generation that failed in the desert is gone, and the younger generation that survived that discipline is now, standing right on the edge of its destiny.
But they can't go forward without the right leader.
Right.
And this is where the divine appointment is so key. IMM affirms Joshua's selection with a very specific, very direct statement. It links Joshua to the greatest figure in their history. The Lord says, "As I was with Moses, I will be with you."
That's more than just a pep talk.
Oh, it's way more. It's the transfer of providence itself. It's the guarantee of the divine presence.
It grounds Joshua's authority in God's constant presence, which is, the one thing they need to succeed. But what's really telling is how the people react. They get it right away. They pledge their loyalty. As we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you.
And that recognition is so critical because it lays out the basic condition of the covenant relationship from the very start. God's faithfulness, the promise of his presence that secures the land as a gift, is tied directly to Israel's required response. Going after that gift in faith and obedience to his rules, the people seem to get it. The success of the whole thing hangs on their spiritual faithfulness, not just on Joshua being a good general.
The book's prologue is set up around 4 speeches that get the plot moving, but God's direct charge to Joshua is the centerpiece.
It is.
It repeats that IMM will give Israel a land, but that promise is connected to 3 specific things Joshua has to do to keep faith. It's a very active kind of faith.
Absolutely. The giving of the land is a guarantee on God's side, but the possessing of it depends on Joshua's actions and his spiritual condition.
So let's walk through those 3 things because they really lay out the whole nature of the conquest. The first one is pretty straightforward, active claiming. To cross the Jordan and actually set foot on the land, you have to physically go into the place God promised.
That's the geographical part of it. The second is about spiritual strength, to be courageous, to fulfill his task. I mean, the size of this task-facing fortified Canaanite cities, that took more than just regular military guts.
It required a different kind of bravery.
It required faith-fueled bravery, the knowledge that they were fighting God's battles, not their own.
But it's the third requirement that really connects everything back to Moses and Deuteronomy. And it's what makes this story so much more than just a tale of conquest. The need to meditate on the law. Why is that specific, inward spiritual practice the key to winning battles?
Because holding on to the land is completely dependent on Israel's obedience to the book of the law. The sources are very clear on this. The war wasn't just about gaining territory. It was fought so Israel could live under God's law in the land, keeping themselves separate from the ethical sickness of the Canaanites.
So meditating on the law is the way they stay faithful.
It's the mechanism. It ensures faithful obedience.
Yeah.
So success isn't about having better chariots or more soldiers.
No, it's about keeping the covenant. If they meditate on the law, they live by God's standards, and that gives them the spiritual right to fight and win.
Precisely. And that leads to a basic theological point. Faith and ethics, not military power or what some critics might call jingoism, are what energize the battle. The fighting is just the practical result of a spiritual reality that comes first. If Joshua and Israel are fully aligned with God's will through the law, they can't lose. That's the core mandate.
So before any battles start, before Jericho's walls come down, Israel goes through three big preparations. The story really slows down here to show how vital reverence and spiritual readiness are.
Right.
Why take time for rituals when the enemy is literally right across the river watching you?
Because the enemy's morale, as we're about to see, had already fallen apart because of what God was doing. These preparations confirm that Israel is entering the land as a holy people, a people worthy of the gift. The order of them is very intentional. It marks that final shift from the wilderness generation to the land generation.
First, they renew the sign of the covenant through circumcision. That must have been a difficult, painful thing to do, especially right on the edge of enemy territory. What does this renewal mean in this particular context?
Well, it's a reaffirmation of the Abrahamic covenant. It says that they are taking the land not just as warriors, but as God's covenant people. And what's more, the wilderness generation, after experiencing God's discipline, had let this sign lapse.
They hadn't been doing it.
No. So bringing it back marks the renewal of their holy status. It shows they are once again set apart. It's a painful physical act that shows an internal spiritual loyalty, and it was needed before entering the Holy Land to fight God's holy wars.
And second, they celebrate the Passover. This is a huge bookend to the whole wilderness experience. What's the theological link being made here, celebrating Passover now, decades after the first one in Egypt?
The Passover connects their entry into the land directly back to their exit from Egypt. It's a reminder that their amazing story started with God's miraculous action, saving them from judgment. It drives home the point that they are not a self-made nation. They were rescued and are kept by grace. It roots their whole identity in God's saving acts.
And right here is where the narrative gives us this brilliant, immediate symbol of their change. The manna stops.
That is where the practical and the theological just come together perfectly. The very next day after the Passover, the manna was gone. They ate the food of the sworn land they had waited so long for.
That's powerful.
It is. The manna, the temporary, boring, but necessary food of the dry wilderness, is finished. It represents the end of that fragile, unsettled, nomadic life. They are now in a land that produces its own food. The promise that the land would provide for them, spoken to the patriarchs, is now physically happening. The shift is complete.
And the last preparation involves Joshua himself, showing total submission to God's authority when he's confronted by the commander of M's army.
This is the moment that makes it clear who is really in charge of this campaign. Joshua takes off his sandals because he knows he's on holy ground.
Right.
And when he asks the commander, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" the answer is neither. And that signals a huge shift in thinking. The war isn't about whether God fights for Israel. It's about whether Israel fights by faith for God. The commander isn't taking a side. He is the side.
So total worship and submission, taking off the sandals, that comes before making war.
It is. This whole sequence confirms it. The campaign is a holy project, and it requires spiritual readiness above everything else.
So now they have a consecrated nation, a clear mission of faith and ethics, and a divinely appointed submissive leader. And now they're facing the Jordan River, which is both a physical and a theological border.
The Jordan crossing, which takes up Joshua chapters 3 and 4, is often just seen as a Red Sea Part 2, but it's much more complicated than a simple repeat. It's a symbolic, a judicial, and a theological event that defines God's identity against the gods of Canaan and validates Israel's legal claim to the land.
What's so fascinating is that the miracle isn't just about moving water so they can walk across. It's about God doing something that speaks directly to the Canaanite way of thinking.
Exactly. The event was a clear statement of God's identity, setting him apart from the local Canaanite gods. This is deeply polemical.
How so?
Well, in Canaanite mythology, the god Baal was seen as the king of the gods because he supposedly defeated the sea god, Yem, or the river god. So for them, control over chaotic waters defined who was supreme.
So when God parts the Jordan, a major river, it's not just a logistical move, it's a public announcement of divine supremacy.
It demonstrates with no room for doubt that I am, not Baal, is the true God and is Lord over the waters. It echoes what he did before at the Red Sea, the flood, and, his control over creation itself. The message is crystal clear. The supposed strength of Canaan's gods, their control over nature, is nothing compared to the true Creator.
And the way the crossing is arranged says so much about God's relationship with his people. The ark, which is the symbol of God's throne and presence, leads the nation into the flooding river.
This really points to the nature of God's action. God and his priests stayed in the place of danger standing in the deepest part of the riverbed, while the whole nation crossed over. This is God, by himself, delivering his people.
He goes into the chaos first.
He does. He protects the holy nation as they step into the land. It reinforces the idea that the whole possession is a gift secured by his presence.
So beyond that theological statement of supremacy, our sources point out this event had a real legal significance in the ancient world. It functioned almost like a court verdict.
This is a point that people often miss. In the ancient Near East, throwing an accused person into a river was a common way to get a judicial verdict. It was called a trial by water. If you survived, it meant the gods had declared you innocent.
That context changes everything. It means God, by putting the ark in the Jordan first and having it stand in the riverbed, passed this trial by water, and in doing so, judicially proved that his and his people's claim to the land was legitimate and divinely given.
It leaves no doubt. God is establishing his ownership and Israel's right to be there. The ark in the middle of the danger validates their cause, and the result was immediate. It was psychological warfare. The source notes that this demonstration of divine victory made the Canaanite kings' hearts melt with fear. They understood the legal meaning of what they had just seen.
So the spiritual conquest started before the physical one, with fear disabling the enemy's will to fight, because their own gods had just been shown to be powerless against the true Lord of the waters.
Beyond that, the crossing represented this massive shift in Israel's day-to-day reality. The move out of the hostile, dangerous, and chaotic wilderness was finally over. The event symbolically marked Israel's change from one state of being to another.
It sounds almost like a mini creation story, moving from disorder to structure.
That's a great way to look at it. The move into the good land completely revised Israel's way of life. It represented a creative change from chaos to ordered cosmos. The Israelites went from a nomadic life where their survival depended on daily miracles like manna to life in a settled, fertile land with the resources already in place. Walled cities, wells, watered plains.
The nation's identity changes from being always on the move to being rooted in a promised place.
Absolutely. The crossing is the moment that solidifies their identity as a settled nation under a specific local covenant. This also connects back to the manna stopping. They now rely on rain and the natural harvest, which teaches them a vital lesson. God cares for the land, and their well-being depends on the rain-giver God, not on their own calculations or irrigation systems like they had seen in Egypt. It's a complete physical and spiritual reorientation.
Okay, Section 3 gives us one of the most brilliant literary and ethical contrasts in the whole book, the fate of Rahab, the outsider, versus the fate of Achan, the insider. This contrast perfectly shows the right theological principle for applying God's law during the conquest. It's all about saving faith versus damning disloyalty.
This contrast is absolutely central. It frames the entire ethical structure of the Holy War. The sources really stress that salvation didn't depend on your ethnicity or how close you were to the covenant, but on a spiritual choice. Loyalty to IMM versus greedy rebellion.
Let's start with Rahab. She's described as a Canaanite's prostitute, the most unlikely candidate for admission into the kingdom of God. And yet she becomes really the first convert by the good news of God.
Her confession is the key. When the spies show up, she doesn't just bargain for her life. She makes a theological confession. She says, I know that I has given you the land and that your dread has fallen upon us.
She sees what's really happening.
She does. Her statement confirmed for the spies that God had already made the enemy's morale collapse. She was acting with a rational, saving faith, turning her back on her pagan gods and risking her life to identify with God's people.
And this action forces the spies to make a tough call about interpretation. Moses' command for total destruction or liquidation was meant to protect Israel from the spiritual poison of the Canaanites, who would turn your sons away from God. Rahab clearly isn't that kind of threat.
That's the heart of it. Because she chose to side with and confess his sovereignty, the reason for didn't apply to her. She wasn't a spiritual danger, he was an ally. The spies interpreted the Mosaic law based on its intent, letting mercy come before judgment.
So that set a huge precedent.
It did. It established a critical principle. Loyalty matters more than ethnicity, and mercy wins out over judgment for those who truly turn to God.
And we know from later in the Bible that this wasn't just a temporary pardon. Rahab was brought into Israel and even ended up in the line of David. Her choice of faith had historical redemptive effects that went far beyond the walls of Jericho.
Right, she's a powerful exception that proves the rule. The Urim command was a protective measure for Israel's holiness, but God always makes room for a genuine faith response, no matter where someone comes from. Her faith actually strengthened Israel's faith right before the battle.
So now we turn to Achan, the Israelite insider, who is the complete opposite of Rahab. He was part of the covenant community, but he showed himself to be totally disloyal by wanting and taking plunder that was devoted to God Urim.
Achan's sin was, at its root, one of irrational greed. At Jericho, all the precious metals, gold, silver, were declared Urim. They were dedicated or consecrated to God's treasury. This was to symbolize that God was the true victor, not Israel.
And Achan took them for himself.
He secretly took these dedicated items, putting his own greed in the place of God.
And the result of this private act of disobedience wasn't just a personal problem, it hurt the entire nation, leading to that humiliating defeat at the Battle of Ai.
This shows that ancient idea of national solidarity or corporate guilt. In the context of the covenant, one person's act of disloyalty affects the whole group because the nation stands before God as one body.
Okay.
Achan's spiritual failure caused God to withdraw his presence from the battle, which led to a military disaster and divine judgment on the nation until the sin was dealt with.
And the judgment was severe. Achan and his whole household were stoned and burned to cleanse the land of the spiritual corruption.
This shows that disloyalty brings judgment and the complete loss of inheritance. I mean, think about the stark contrast. Rahab, the outsider, through saving faith and action, gets an inheritance and is given life. Achan, the insider, through disloyalty and greed, loses his life and his potential inheritance. The sources make it clear that spiritual preparation, defined by strict obedience to God's standards, is what actually brings victory, not just being a member of the covenant community. The law's intent is to maintain purity for those inside the covenant, but to show mercy to those outside who genuinely seek God.
To really get the theological paradox, we have to look at the overall structure of the book. The sources explain that the narrator ties Joshua together with a common theme, claiming the sworn land by faith. And this theme shapes the three big sections, taking the land, allotting it, and retaining it.
The whole book covers the events of one generation, from Moses' death to Joshua's death. The three parts are structurally marked off, and they often use a summary line that stresses that the Lord gave the land and Israel took it, but each part builds up more and more tension about how well Israel is actually fulfilling its task.
So part 1, taking the land, Joshua chapters 1 through 12. This is all about conquest and compromise.
Right.
The focus here is on military subjugation. It presents a string of intense victory reports, Jericho, Ai, the Southern Campaign, the Northern Campaign, and it all leads up to that powerful statement that the land had rest from war.
And the narrator uses rhetorical hyperbole, which was common in ancient Near Eastern conquest stories. But here it has a critical theological job. The Hebrew term kol, meaning entire, all, whole, is used again and again, 18 times in just one short summary section. And that's to build this impression of total, decisive victory.
This is a really key point. If the sources later admit that a lot of land was still unconquered, why use such final-sounding language?
Because the language is theological, not just a historical inventory. The narrator is presenting the already viewpoint. God has decisively defeated the organized resistance of the Canaanite kings, and he has secured the land for Israel. The main central war of subjugation is won.
Which means the promise given to the patriarchs has been fulfilled.
Legally and theologically, yes, it has been fulfilled.
But right away, the narrator introduces some tension and qualifies this total success with historical exceptions.
Yeah, the victory was decisive against organized resistance, but it wasn't absolutely complete in a geographical or demographic sense.
Right.
We see this tension pop up early with the failure of Ai because of Achan's sin, but also with that clever but unholy treaty with the Gibeonites.
They didn't ask God about that one.
They failed to consult God before making that oath, and it became a permanent compromise. The source material also notes that some of the fortified giants, the Anakim, were still left in what would later become Philistia. This sets up the problem for the next generation. The victory is won, but the cleanup work is still left to do.
Okay, so that brings us to part 2, allotting the land in chapters 13 to 21. This is about distribution and unrealized desire.
The second section completely shifts gears. It moves from conquest to administration. The focus is on the divine authority for the distribution, which was done by Lot. This reinforced the idea of the land as God's sovereign gift.
And this section structurally reinforces that already viewpoint you mentioned.
It does. God gave them the whole land, so now they're dividing up the territory. The distribution was handled by Eleazar the priest, Joshua, and the heads of the tribal clans, which ensured divine guidance. However, the section starts with a massive qualifier.
The qualification being the land that remained. Joshua is old, and God points out that huge tracts of territory still remain to be possessed.
This really highlights the difference between a theological gift and practical possession. God has given them the entire land, fulfilling his promise. But Israel's duty to occupy and clear their tribal allotments still had to happen, little by little. And as this section goes on, the tension of non-possession and non-fulfillment just grows. They're starting to get comfortable.
And this is where we see the steady unraveling of coherence, as one source put it. The tribal failures begin.
The failure is concrete. Tribes like Ephraim and Manasseh failed to drive out the Canaanites from their cities, specifically mentioning the Canaanites who had iron chariots. This was a failure of faith. They saw the enemy's military strength instead of God's command.
So they left these pockets of resistance.
Yes, and that introduced gaps in and within their borders. The book starts with the success of Judah, but it moves toward the failure of Dan, whose eventual displacement shows their lack of faith in holding their territory. The allocation of land before it was fully possessed was a constant test of faith and obedience for the tribes.
We should also touch on the unique inheritance of the Levites, which kind of frames these distribution accounts.
Right. The Levites got a different kind of inheritance, God and his offerings. They didn't get a tribal plot of farmland like the other tribes. Moses had promised them 48 towns with pasture lands, which the Israelites gave them from their own inheritances. This distinction reminds the people of the spiritual priority. The priestly tribe's well-being is completely tied to God's provision and the people's faithfulness.
That's interesting.
And what's more, even the Levites had to take some of their allotted towns by faith's obedience, as many of these were still in Canaanite hands when they were assigned.
So the final section, part 3, Retaining the Land, chapters 22 to 24, is about covenant fidelity. It demonstrates that Israel has to hold on to the land in the same way they got it, through covenant faithfulness. The victory is won, the land is distributed, but keeping it is conditional.
This section is all about covenant loyalty. It's built around 3 main episodes: the issue of intertribal unity with the Eastern Tribes altar, Joshua's farewell speech, and the covenant renewal ceremony. All 3 stress the need for unity and obedience.
And Joshua holds the covenant renewal at 2 places Moses instructed, tying this final section all the way back to Deuteronomy.
First, at Mount Ebal, which happens at the literary turning point of the battle scenes. The altar they built there symbolized God's claim to the land, and the law written on the stones defined the nature of his rule over that territory. Second, the covenant was renewed at Shechem, where Jacob had gotten rid of foreign gods before.
A place with historical weight.
A lot of it. And here, the people declare their intention to serve I Am and throw away their foreign gods.
But Joshua's farewell address is the final warning. It looks back on God's past success, but predicts Israel's future failure.
His speech is a very sober reflection, and it pulls directly from the warnings in Deuteronomy. He predicts that Israel will eventually be kicked out of the land because of apostasy. The closing scene at Shechem is deeply unsettling and ironic.
How so?
Joshua tells them flat out that they are not able to keep the covenant because of the sinfulness of the human heart. And yet, in their spiritual high, they declare their absolute faithfulness 3 times. We will serve I Am.
And that overconfident declaration seals their fate.
It acts as an irony that casts a shadow over the book's conclusion. They trusted their own strength and willpower to keep the covenant, instead of relying completely on God's grace and provision to uphold their end of the deal. Joshua warns them that God is a holy God who will not put up with their sin. Their self-reliance just set the stage for the history we read about in the book of Judges.
Okay, so now let's synthesize this theological tension across the whole book, bringing together the conquests, the failures, and the warnings. We see this clear tension between God's faithful promises, the indicative, and Israel's inconsistent obedience, the imperative.
The foundation of the whole book is divine faithfulness. The book says again and again that God faithfully kept his promissory covenants, fulfilling the promises to the patriarchs centuries later. The opening promises and the closing reminders all confirm this. The narrator uses active verbs to stress God's role. I took, I gave, and I brought. The land is presented, first and last, as a gift of grace.
But the narrative is just as concerned with human failure.
The possession and the keeping of the land were conditional on obedience to God's covenant and meditating on the law. Israel had to go after the promises in faith, and actively follow God's standards. There's no conflict between God's promise and the conditions placed on people.
So grace and obedience work together.
Grace establishes the relationship and provides the gift, but obedience is the required response for enjoying and keeping the blessings of that gift. The sources point out that trust and obedience have to work together. They complement each other.
So the initial success was a result of faith and obedience, but the narrator knew the long story of history. Israel's heart was prone to unfaithfulness, which is why Joshua gives such a grim farewell speech.
The narrator is writing a history that's already looking ahead to the exile. The structure of the narrative, moving from conquest hyperbole in Part 1 to tribal failure in Part 2, and then to the warning of expulsion in Part 3, is a very sophisticated theological statement about the limits of human ability to maintain a holy covenant.
The already not yet framework is how the narrator resolves the tension between the glorious victory reports of Part 1 and the documented incomplete possession in Part 2. This is the central theological idea we wanted to understand.
It is the biblical writer's way of handling redemptive history. So let's define the already. The already refers to the decisive establishment of God's kingdom and the fulfillment of the promise through Joshua's initial decisive victories. The organized war of subjugation was a success, and the narrator confirms the land had rest from war. From God's point of view, the promise is secured, the gift has been given.
And the not yet acknowledges the lingering duties that are left for future generations.
Correct. The not yet confirms that complete possession and rest are expandable themes. They weren't fully finished in Joshua's generation. Future generations have to continue the conquest and hold on to the land through ongoing faithfulness. The ultimate allotments they envisioned, like Philistia, never actually happened under Joshua. That final, clean sweep rest was conditional on generations of faithful action.
This tension explains why the narrator could use rhetorical hyperbole, that word coup, to declare total victory in chapter 12, even while chapter 13 immediately admits large areas of land were still unconquered.
The narrator is using language that honors God's fulfilled promise. He describes the victory as complete theologically, because God granted it and defeated this central resistance. The sources give that analogy of a mural of a glorious sunrise. The painter shows the sun fully risen, representing the decisive conquest as complete.
But there are still shadows.
Yes. The corners of the canvas still show lingering shadows, representing the territories that were left. The central victory is won by God, but full illumination requires ongoing, diligent human effort.
It's a framework that the New Testament writers use to talk about the arrival of the kingdom of God. It is here already in the person of Christ, but not yet in its full, completed sense. The blueprint is set centuries earlier in Joshua's conquest.
And the closing scene really brings out the tragic irony. The book asserts a successful end to subduing the land because of God's faithfulness, but at the same time it marks the beginning of Israel's failed history of trying to keep it because of human unfaithfulness.
The victory is achieved, but their ability to keep it is immediately in question.
The prediction of future failure just casts this sobering shadow over the whole victory. The covenant renewal at Shechem ends up as a final witness against the people. Because they trusted their own strength to keep the covenant, they were set up to fail. Joshua warns them that when they turn away, God's faithfulness to his word will turn from doing them good to destroying them, enforcing the curses of the covenant, which include being thrown out of the land.
It's a heavy conclusion.
Joshua is a book about grace and fulfillment, but the conclusion is a big warning about self-reliance and the human inability to live up to God's high standards.
So the book of Joshua gives us 3 key theological takeaways from this deep dive, all focused on the movement from chaos to covenant life.
First, we establish God's absolute supremacy. This was shown polemically and judicially at the Jordan crossing, proving he is Lord over the waters and legally validating Israel's claim to the land, setting him completely apart from the nature gods of Canaan.
Second, the proper application of the law's intent puts mercy's seat first for the truly repentant. The story of Rahab proves that faith and loyalty are more determinative than ethnic background when it comes to judgment germ, setting a standard for inclusion to the covenant people.
And third, we learned about the need for constant faith and obedience to claim and keep God's gifts. This is that already not yet viewpoint. The promise of the land is secured by God's grace, but possession, rest, and keeping it are conditionally dependent on sustained human faithfulness to the law.
The historical framework of Joshua, a successful conquest followed by a conditional possession that leads to an inevitable, predicted failure, it invites you to think about the persistent pattern of human inability to keep a covenant, even with the most spectacular displays of divine faithfulness.
If the land was the goal and desire of the people of God,
What does this cycle of promise and failure teach us about where our true hope for rest must lie? If Joshua secured the promise but couldn't secure the keeping of it because of human sin, we're led to look for a greater Joshua, a Messiah, who can not only bring us into the true inheritance but also grant the perfect obedience needed for us to keep it forever.